Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me today is going to be Andrew Goodman. And we're going to talk about his book he recently come out with called the Synchronicity Code. Pardon my tongue tie up there. It's something that he's been developing over the last few years that he thinks he sees something in the underlying background, if I understand this correctly, of the fabric of time and space, that there's a code that things are timed out and happening at certain points in time that you could almost set a clock by. And he calls this the Synchronicity Code. And I can guarantee you, after reading this book, he can explain this far better than I can. It was a fascinating read. I did read it myself. And the math was a little bit beyond me at my present stage, but a little bit of study, I think I can get that down pat. But I'm going to let him tell us a little bit more about it because I don't want to mess everything up. So, Andrew, how you doing?
Very well. Thank you for having me on your program.
Oh, and I want to thank you for coming. I've really been looking forward to this show for quite some time. Did I get that description wrong?
No, that's a fair start at the description, but maybe I can try to summarize it a little bit. I'm going to give you a kind of a long-winded explanation for how I came to it, and maybe that's really the best way to sort of found this. Before I do that, there are really two concepts to hold in mind that help clarify what this is about. One of them is obviously the word synchronicity, which is a term that was invented by C.G. Jung, the great psychologist, which there's certainly a more complicated definition, but for our purposes it suffices to just refer to that as a meaningful coincidence. One thing that we do find in this particular study is that coincidences are not, or one type of coincidence that becomes prominent is when you have numeric coincidences, ones dealing with exact numbers repeating or multiples of 10, 100, that kind of thing, as a specific numeric synchronicity of a kind. So that's one concept. And the other one, which is much more accessible, I think, is just the notion of cycles, which we see in nature, of course, everywhere. It has been studied quite a bit in the last century or so in terms of economic cycles. And in a way, that's how I came to this particular discovery. I found myself, I'm a lawyer by trade, but early on in my professional career, I became interested in the markets, in fact, very interested, in part because I was wrestling with trying to resolve my natural interests in things of religion and philosophy with the need to make a living, and I found myself attracted to the trading markets, partly because one day I accidentally came across a advertisement in Futures magazine by a man named Robert Fisher, who was marketing a trading system that was based upon the golden section or the Fibonacci ratio. This struck a chord with me. I'm sure it has with many, but it struck a chord with me in particular because of my interest in philosophy. I majored in philosophy in college. It immediately resounded because of its relationship to the ancient Greek view that all was arranged according to number. So that if Fisher was right that you could detect cyclical patterns in the markets based upon the Fibonacci ratio, then it would be sort of a practical, real-world proof of this theory that was presented thousands of years ago in ancient Greece. So it was that trading background that I think led to this discovery that certainly can be applied to the markets, but really what the discovery was is that there are mathematically precise cycles in historical events that happen to be glued together by the phenomenon of synchronicity. That is the piece that I think was so novel for me to discover. I can tell you, if we have a moment and you want to digress on it, how exactly that piece came into play. But that was the step that was surprising to me. The way it all came about was I was in the office with a friend a couple of years ago, and was just casually talking about trading in the markets. And at one point I said to him, I bet you those cycles that I study in the markets apply to everything, down to your very sneezes. That was the phrase I used, and he looked at me quizzically, but for me, a light bulb went off in my head. And that night I came home and started Googling around the internet and started looking at historical events, and it was very exciting to see almost from the beginning that if you pick certain prominent historical events, you could see these patterns begin to emerge almost immediately. At first, I thought this was that the typical cliche saying is things happen in three. So
right.
I assumed anytime you had a similar event occur, you would have some sort of a mathematical pattern to it. So I'd be driving to work, and a squirrel would run in front of my car, and then 15 minutes later, another squirrel would run in front of my car, and I'd think, okay, let's look at the mathematical projection of that for the third squirrel. I no longer feel that way. I think that's, by the way, similar. Do you know, or have you heard of Kammerer's seriality? He was an Austrian scientist and writer just before the time of Jung, who I think actually influenced Jung in terms of his theory of synchronicity.
I don't think I heard of him.
Well, he's not that well known in the West, but he actually probably had something to do with Jung's theory, and isn't typically credited with that. But he had a scientific mind, and he would go out into a park, and he would start counting these clusters of events. A person would be walking in front of him that had an umbrella, and then he'd wait, and there'd be another umbrella. He'd add up and very meticulously study these patterns of people carrying umbrellas on a sunny day or not. And he developed this theory that events actually cluster in a way that really was a synchronicity concept. But he was approaching it without the notion of a meaningful coincidence. It was really just any coincidence. He looked for these patterns. But where I quickly moved away was from thinking that any three events that are of the same nature are going to have a cyclical pattern. I don't think that's really the place to go. It may be true, but that's not where my focus began to go. Instead, if you take a look at if you're studying cycles in the markets, it's clear you have a high and a low, and a high and a low. You can do a cycle of, you take the time distance between two highs, and you can project forward a third high, mathematically, quite simply, by taking the distance in terms of hours or days or weeks or months and multiplying it forward. But in events occurring in history, there are no peaks, there are no highs and lows the same way there are in the market. So what is the thing that serves as the marker for an historical event that will tie it to future events? This is where meaningful coincidences, I think, come to the fore. So, Royce, with that introduction, where does this bring you in terms of how I've articulated it so far?
Sounds pretty in-depth, but real quick, I don't want to forget to tell everybody that if they want to learn more, they can go to your website, www.synchronicitycode.com. And also, I got your link right here under your picture at the description below, as well as your book linked over to Amazon, and it'll be in my archives later. And I also want to remind you listeners, because not everybody listens at my site, that you can also call in at 832-632-7904, and I'll be answering the lines. And if I pick up a line you hear talking, that's me answering the line before it goes to voicemail, while my guest is still talking without interrupting my guest. So don't be surprised if y'all do that. Just patiently waiting. As soon as we get an opening, I'll announce that you're on the line with us. Now, there was something you said a minute ago, Andrew, about the part you wanted to digress on, or you want to know if I wanted to digress on, I mean?
Oh, yeah. It was just one of the early discoveries I made that really struck me as to the synchronicity connection. It's a story of a coincidence that's well, you can look on the internet, and it's one of the most extraordinary coincidences. But before I do that, I should really just give a brief explanation of the mathematics of this, so that your listeners can understand the concept. And it's really quite simple. If you take any two events that you propose might have a meaningful link together. I mean, the obvious one would be the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865. Those two presidents have an extraordinary number of coincidences surrounding their lives and administrations, which we could also go into. But just assuming that those are the two of the most seminal, president assassinations, the two most seminal assassinations in the history of this country. So you might say, okay, that's a pairing that we want to now analyze to see if there is a third event or more than one third, fourth, fifth event that is related to that mathematical distance of time. Now, what's the simplest way that one could divide or multiply that distance over time? You could cut it in half. So there's a 50% division. You could look at natural simple fractions like 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, 2/3, and look to see what happens at those precise intervals in between the two dates. Or you're going to have to think a little outside the box to see that that second date, the JFK date, might actually be the middle date for a third event that has not yet happened, for example. So you need to be able to project those natural fractions forward into future dates. There's one other mathematical relationship that I consider very prominent and important besides 1/2, 1/4, 1/3, and that is 0.618 to 1. That's the Fibonacci ratio. It's something that, I don't know, I think what you had said to me once in an email or a call that you have had some interest in sacred geometry. Have you studied much the Fibonacci ratio?
I have actually heard about it, and I understand that this is it's kind of like the golden mean. It runs through almost everything. You can't hardly look at a leaf or a flower petal or the cells in your own body without finding it, has been my understanding.
Yes, I think that's a view that is taken, and some researchers believe that there's a simple natural explanation for why it appears the way it does, as a natural spacing of objects that would grow in order to expose themselves to light and so forth. And the ratio also is very important to the ancients. Not only does it appear prominently in the pyramids, but as well the Greek temples, the Parthenon, and so forth.
I think it was also important to the Sumerians.
Yeah, I think it very very well may have been. So that's and one very quick example that you can certainly check. It's referred to in the book that utilize the Fibonacci ratio is in the early American wars. There is a very precise link of really the first three main wars of this country. The Revolutionary War began in 1775. The Civil War began in 1861, and World War I began in 1914. If you apply the Fibonacci ratio to that, the 0.618 calculation, you take the distance between the two outer dates, which I think is, if I'm remembering, 139 years, and you multiply that by 0.618, the Fibonacci ratio, you hit 1861. And it's so therefore to the year it is precise as to the mathematical ratio of the Fibonacci ratio. It is in fact even more precise because if you use not the yearly time scale but the daily, it turns out that the Civil War began just 14 days from the precise daily mark between the start of the Revolutionary War on April 19th, 1775, and World War I on June 28th, 1914. So that's a perfect example of what I would be looking for in terms of trying to find these patterns in historical events. Okay,
yeah,
so
and you found these also in historical events like wars and as well as like terrorism attacks and famous people's histories and a lot of things, though, now, didn't you?
Yeah, and I, in fact, one way to think about this, I know you've looked at the book, so I can't ask you the question and get the same sort of unformed thought. But if you think of any of the major seminal events of American history since the Revolutionary War to now, I think almost everything you would name, you could just throw it out. Any of the major wars, any of the major assassinations, the Kennedy curse, the terrorist attacks, 9/11, Oklahoma, the Oklahoma City bombing, any of these major events that stand out in bas relief, you can take it and analyze it with respect to the Synchronicity Code and find the patterns. And in fact, the book goes through many of them. So I may have missed something that would have been prominent and interesting, but I was myself surprised to see how easy it was to identify the patterns once I began looking for them. I would say, and maybe you noticed this, Royce, when you were reading it, that there's the easy marks, the easy ones to find, are actually often negative. Somebody gets shot. Somebody dies unexpectedly. A terrorist bombing occurs. A war starts. Those are all pretty ominous events. It isn't only that, as I'm sure you saw in the book. I was at pains to try to bring out some of the more positive ones, and a little bit later on, I'd like to just touch on perhaps my most favorite positive pattern that was formed. But I did find myself getting a little bit distraught's a little too strong a word, but there's a certain negativeness to the patterns of history that stand out according to these patterns. All right, so this was all intended as a way of background to circle back to the notion of synchronicity.
Okay.
And this early on, I began to think, okay, what is the glue that ties these historical events together? I noticed, for example, that Lincoln and Kennedy had all of these coincidences attached. So I started doing some research on coincidences, and I came across on the internet what is apparently one of the most remarkable coincidences of all that would make the top 10 list of any coincidence, if it were true, of any that you could find. And it has to do with a man named Hugh Williams, who was a sailor or a passenger on a ship on December 5th, 1664. A ship sank on that day in the Menai Strait off the coast of Wales, and there was one survivor of the ship, and his name was Hugh Williams. 121 years later, there was another shipwreck off the Menai Strait on December 5th, again the day December 5th, 1785. And all the passengers died except for one individual, named Hugh Williams. So right there, that's a startling coincidence. But it's not the end of it. On December 5th, 1860, there was a small vessel, again off the coast of Wales in the Menai Strait, that sunk, and there was one sole survivor named Hugh Williams. It's a ridiculous coincidence. And when you read it or when you come across it on the internet, you'll think, somebody's pulling my leg. This is just ridiculous. I did come across some that comment that analyzed it and said, well, it's not that uncommon. Hugh Williams happens to be a very common name, or at least was at that time, and there's been a lot of shipwrecks off the Menai Strait. So they were trying to argue that while it sounds stunning in terms of a coincidence, it really is not as stunning as it sounds. But for me, this turns out to be a very strong confirmation that the theory is onto something. First, recognize that all three of these dates identified in these sources all were December 5th when the shipwreck occurred. But what no one knew who wrote this story up was that there might be a mathematical ratio at work connecting the three events. And it's right there. It's as clear as day that, again, 0.618, the Fibonacci ratio, exactly marks the middle date of the shipwreck, which again had Hugh Williams as the sole survivor. When I saw that, I knew I was onto something with the notion that synchronicity, meaningful coincidences, are central to the workings of these cyclical forces in historical events. But you can also turn that around, and you could say, so first of all, it's very interesting that historical events could be patterned this way, but it also opens up the other side of the equation. Jung never spoke of synchronicity as anything but a unpredictable, one-off, just-so story. It happens one time. I mean, do you know the story, the most famous story that Jung would tell about how he came up with his theory involving the golden scarab? Are you aware of that?
I think you mentioned it in your book, but before we go any further, and that might be a bad memory, I wanted to mention to you a minute ago, you started, like you were breaking up. I thought maybe you were on a wireless phone and had a weak battery, or you were on a wireless phone and walking, but you got distorted for a while and then you got better. Are you on a wireless phone by any chance?
It is wireless. It's not a cell phone, but it is wireless, and that's all I have. But I've been in one place. If that happens again, interrupt me, please, and I'll try to move. But it should not have been interrupted. I'm sorry if that happened.
Oh, I mean, they're still able to make you out. It's just that it was, getting kind of difficult. And I thought maybe he was, on a wireless phone, and maybe he was having a signal, or some kind of issue going on there, because that does happen. You know how today's technology is.
Right.
But yeah, I have heard about the story of Egypt and their scarab. And it seems to me like I remember also reading about it in your book. You did mention it, didn't you?
Yes, I did. And just to briefly put it, his discovery, he credits in part a patient of his was having a session with him and was recounting a story of a golden scarab that appeared in one of her dreams. And at just the moment that she was reciting the dream, there was suddenly a tapping on a window outside the room. Jung opened the window and between two fingers grabbed an insect that flew in, and it was a beetle. So he walks it over to the woman and says, "Here, madam, is your golden scarab." And the discovery really was that the inner event of the psychological experience of the dream met out of reality at that particular moment. So there was this coincidence of meaning that linked the inner content of the patient with these outer events. So this then became the basis of a fascinating theory that there's a connection between what happens on the outside and what happens on the inside. It goes in many directions. I mean, the law of attraction, which is so interesting and popular a subject, is really an expression, perhaps, of a similar principle. But what I think is interesting about the Synchronicity Code in particular is that it moves the theory of synchronicity from these one-off experiences that are, you can't predict them, they're not related to anything else, into something that is in relation to other events, mathematically in relation to other events. How is that possible, even? It seems quite extraordinary. The only thing that helps us to understand it is we have to go back to what the ancient Greeks said, which is all is arranged according to number. What does that mean? How do we understand that? I mean, you can certainly take a statistical view of that, which is what modern science does. It uses number all the time to build buildings, to make rocket ships, whatever. But this is really about more of a qualitative nature of number, being intrinsic to the way events unfold. So I think what it does is it's an exciting new dimension, at least to me, to the very theory of synchronicity that was taught by Jung 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Okay. Real quick, like I was going to mention I just noticed that Megred, and I may be pronouncing it wrong, showed up from United Paranormal International. I think he is a director over there, and first time here, I wanted to observe him live on the air that he was here. Oh, he's an international membership chairman over there, or she is, and I hope I'm not getting in trouble not knowing if it's a he or a she, but I thought I'd throw that out there since I saw him in the chat room along with Leslie. Now, I wanted to also ask you another question that Leslie asked me a minute ago in the chat room. It came in several bits and pieces, so I may have this wrong. But he said, for the guest, are the synchronistic events linked by an underlying process that repeat? And maybe I ought to stop right there because these look like they may be at least one or two separate questions.
Okay. I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Are they linked by a process? Well, first of all, I don't know what they're linked by, other than to say that one could take the position that they're linked by time itself. You don't look beyond the passage, the mathematical correlation between events themselves for the explanation of the reoccurrence of the phenomenon. So where it went for me in terms of trying to understand this is that, well, first of all, if there's truth to this, and I think if anyone listening is interested in this, look at the book, look at the website, and you need to see some of these examples because they're not more, or in some cases they're not just more or less correct. They're precise, and they're precise sometimes over vast periods of time. So, you can pull the research just as well as I can. I mean, anyone can look at the known events of history, and you may, if it's back too far, you may have to make some adjustments for changes in the Gregorian calendar and so forth. But you can do the research. You can look at this and say, is this a real thing or not? The book covers many, many examples, and many of them are extremely precise. So you can look at this and make your own judgment. But then we're all faced with the same question. What does it mean? How do we understand that historical events not only famous events, but really events in your own life, the life of your children and your parents. They too will exhibit this phenomenon. How could that even be? So, in a way, it's full stop right there. What it does say to me is that we really have no idea what life is. We're just, this is such a novel phenomenon that it really opens up the question: what is life? What is my relationship to you? What is Abraham Lincoln's relationship to JFK? So I find it very fascinating, and to me, it actually leads. One can only get more philosophical by looking at this, not less. And I think it really leads towards the view that we're not what we think we are. We as human beings, as living beings, we're connected in ways that we heretofore haven't imagined. So when you have these, events that are occurring across time, the very fact that they are precisely connected in the way that they appear to be almost suggests that it is one motion. It's like it's one arm is moving from the left to the right, and it's mathematically correlated to get from one place to the other, and it's not just passing through space, it's also passing through time. So Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy are really part of one motion in some way. What that means, I mean, maybe that sounds silly, but there's this aspect of one large being instead of lots of little beings seems to be emerged for me out of this discovery.
Okay. Now, he also had some other questions I got down here. And I myself had a question I've been waiting for since I read your book about the connection between the Synchronicity Code and reincarnation that I thought perhaps might be there that you might be able to see or clear up. But he was also asking, he said what he means is your reason for the synchronicity or, like processes that occur in human society. I told him it was a great question. Anyway, I think what he's trying to say is, what is it that's causing these events to happen? Is there no kind of causal factor or causal link causing the things to repeat in this kind of a fashion?
Well, first of all, Jung's notion was that the very existence of synchronicity was what he called an acausal connecting principle, meaning that you can't find in the typical laws of cause and effect a relationship that explains the link between two things. It's a little bit like the experiment with the electron or the photon that goes through two holes in a metal plate at the same time, even though it's one object, in quantum physics. So I think the answer on one level, the answer is it would appear to be more of an acausal connecting principle than a causal one. But another level in which you could answer the question is you look for, in particular, you're looking for high intensity meaning that strikes an emotional chord to the individual, to the nation, even. If you want to find code sequences, then focus on the things that were of the highest psychological interest to the people that were experiencing it at the time. So, therefore, 9/11, Al-Qaeda, the killing of Bin Laden, the assassination of JFK, the start of Pearl Harbor, the start of World War I. All of these things were of high intensity events. That's where you're going to find it. Again, this is what's so interesting about this is that we're really speaking about the interface of human cognition, the ability to cognate what's happening to us as human beings, with the very formation of patterns of history. If nobody noticed that somebody died in the woods, chances are that's not going to become part of a meaningful pattern. It's because it's literally the energy of our consciousness that is the grounding for the event. And really, that's true with Jung too, in terms of synchronicity. It's those when synchronicity appears, it's numinous. It's meaningful to the people that are experiencing it.
You're kind of fading off again. You.
All right, maybe I better move to another spot. Let me know if it gets better or worse.
Well, just better just a second ago.
Okay, I'll try to be over here instead. Can you hear me now?
A little low, but yeah, I can hear you.
All right, I'll speak a little louder again.
Okay, sorry about that, but like I said, technology, it can be strange.
Right.
Okay.
Was there a question you wanted to ask Royce about reincarnation?
Yeah, there is, but while you were talking, Leslie did clarify something. He said, okay, where was that? He means there are causes to events, but what links the events?
What links them one to the other?
I think that's what he's saying, yeah.
Well, I mean, here's an example. Let's go through an actual example. Maybe that's the best way to do it. We started, I gave you this example of assassination of Lincoln and assassination of JFK. If you were going to take those, you see the coincidences between those two assassinations, and now you're going to look for, are there any other events that are mathematically correlated with those two seminal events? If you cut there's a little under 100 years that separates the assassination of Lincoln in 1865 and the assassination of JFK in 1963. If you cut it in half, you get 1914. That's the year of perhaps the single most important assassination that has occurred in the modern world, which was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. That was important because that was the beginning of World War I. Literally, that event was triggered the first truly massive world war in the history of mankind. So what links it, how you find it, is simple mathematics. Finding the natural fractions between two outer events, or multiplying two events into the future or into the past to find a third or sometimes more events. I'll give you a second example using the same assassination cycle, because this is really so fascinating. And that is, there were two other American presidents that were assassinated and killed, were attempted to be assassinated and actually were successfully murdered. That was Garfield and McKinley. Now, what's very interesting about the way the code sequences work is sometimes you'll find more than one timeline at work that correlate to the same future event. So if you took Lincoln's assassination and Archduke Ferdinand's assassination, and you doubled that time frame, you're going to get the assassination of JFK. But at the same time, if you take the interval between Lincoln's assassination and Garfield's assassination, which was in 1881, and rolled that forward 16 years, etc., you actually hit November 19th, 1963. That's within 3 days of the date of the assassination of JFK. So, and realize that this was found after I had already identified the connection between Archduke Ferdinand and Lincoln and Kennedy. So what we get is, in effect, a triangulation of events that pinpoint a future event, and only one date would in fact match both sequences as precisely as they did. So that's one of the tools that one could use if one were to really try to work with this principle to, in some cases, predict the possibility of a future event.
Right.
Prediction, by the way, is a big subject, which is a nuanced subject. So if we have time, I'd like to touch on that. But I'm moving ahead of your other question, so I'll pause for a second.
Okay. And I hate to have to tell you this here, but I'd already promised my son I'd do his birthday party at 2, so we don't want to stay too awfully late. I got like 20 more minutes to go before his 21st birthday party. But let's try to go ahead and get around to this because I don't want you to, miss anything either. What I was thinking was, and it may go along what Les was asking, was do you think there could be any connection between the Synchronicity Code and reincarnation? Maybe the link he was looking for might be people repeating what they've done in a past life in a new lifetime to work out karma, for example, maybe?
It's a very, very interesting question, and there has been. I have not done enough research to be able to answer you definitively, but I would say that when in the cases I did look at, I did not find the pattern that I've seen in other events in proposed cases of reincarnation. One of the most famous involves the artist T-Camp, and I actually exchanged with his lifelong partner about it, and we analyzed some of the events that occurred in his life, and ultimately it was not conclusive. So could there be a link? I thought it would be fascinating to see, and I think more research is required, if some of the proposed cases of reincarnation could be tracked in terms of code sequencing as a way of validating the claim of reincarnation. Part of the issue may be that the death of an individual and rebirth of that individual falls sometimes, maybe, assuming reincarnation is true, which I don't know, but the time between death and rebirth may be quite short. And so there's an inherent difficulty in the mathematics, because you really can only look at fractions that fall somewhere in the middle between events. You're pushing the envelope a little bit when you have an interval of time that is quite short. It still can be worked with, but you need to use a slightly different principle that involves rolling over a short interval very precisely, perhaps, but rolling over that short interval to see if it connects over many iterations. So it's possible, but the short answer to your question is more research is needed.
Well, I was thinking that it might be needed when I thought about it while I was reading the book, and I kind of figured that you might even give you an idea to have something to check into, if not you, maybe some of my listeners who might want to read your book and then delve into it from that angle, and who knows, maybe come up with more information than what you have so far. You never know what the future holds for sure, after all.
Right.
Okay, but I want to go ahead and get to the part you wanted to cover about the future. I don't want you to have it, end up missing that by accident. And I told people in the chat room while you were talking that I think we need to have you back when we have more time. And actually, I got at least one person in there that agreed. The other one might have agreed and just didn't get it typed yet. So I'm hoping that you'll consider coming back, say, later in May, because I'm pretty well booked into May right now, and continuing on where we left off and trying to be able to take more time, because I didn't know I was going to have this going on today when we talked. It was really supposed to happen last week, and some people canceled out, and then we got stuck with a reschedule at the last minute. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, birthdays are important. And in fact, let me give you an example of how important they can be. And then I know you're running out of time, but I will then go to the question of predicting
the future. Okay.
Yeah, predicting the future. But the one thing that, again, I've had many little pieces that have confirmed for me the merit of this discovery, and one of them, and again, I won't share the exact dates because they're personal, but I was really quite stunned to see that I have twin girls and an older boy, and there is the number of days between the birth of the girls and the birth of their brother was something in the vicinity of 1,230 odd days. When I took that interval and rolled it backwards, around something around 40 years, it hit to within 1 day of my wife's birth. Now, I don't know if that sounds too confusing to appreciate it, but it's like hitting a hole in one from the farthest Tiger Woods shot you can imagine on a golf course. And when it happened to the very person that discovered this, to me, there's no way for me to fudge that or to search through many records to find a case like that. It happened to my own family. So, I highly respect the significance of birthdays. Once I saw that, I could not have that view. Now to prediction.
Okay.
One of the as I said a little bit earlier, as I was beginning to work on this project, I actually dropped it for a while because I found it a little bit, as I said, it was a little bit of the adverse events that I was studying in history to find the patterns. It left me with a sort of an unpleasant feeling in my stomach that I was, who wants to be seeing all of this death and destruction falling on a mathematical chart. So I kind of put it aside. But then an event occurred that made me pull it out again because it just seemed too important for me to just abandon it. And that was, clearly one of the most important events that has occurred in the last several years was the bombing of the World Trade Center and 9/11. And in the book, I make the case for this event being the most perhaps the single strongest case for the Synchronicity Code of any that I found. It links together many events down over the last 60 or 70 years, and it pinpoints to the date of Pearl Harbor in particular, again being the theme of surprise attack, quite precisely, literally down to the same day. Again, this is like the birthday story I just told you, only you're taking the interval between the first bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. I happened to be in the building when that happened, actually, and the second one at 9/11, taking that interval of approximately 8.5 years, but taking the exact daily interval and rolling it back 60 years to hit December 7th, 1941. Now, that cycle, that surprise attack cycle, actually hits other seminal surprise attacks in the world between the start of the U.S. involvement in World War II and the present, including the commencement of the Korean War in 1950. Now, why that's significant is that if you take that same interval on a daily basis and you add it to September 11th, 2001, you get March 26, 2010. That's now almost 2 years ago. And you will recall if there was one event that occurred in that entire year that you would label surprise attack, it would be the event that occurred the next day on March 27th, 2010, which is the day when North Korea launched a torpedo and sunk a South Korean ship, killing many, if not all, on board. That was a surprise attack, and it was in complete keeping with the line that had been established with the Korean War in 1950. So there could be no mistaking that this was clearly an expression of the code that occurred after I started writing. I had already written up the entire section dealing with 9/11 and Pearl Harbor, and I was perfectly aware that the next iteration was coming up. And then to have it happen right on cue, it just felt to me that it was I'm onto something here, and it doesn't seem right for me to just walk away from it without at least letting the rest of the world know about it, so they can decide what to do with all this. So you could look at that event and say this event was predictable. There's a lot of limitations to the notion that one can predict a future event. You don't know the scope of it. You don't know really where it's going to happen. You don't even know for sure that it's going to happen. So my experience with it is that, yes, there's something about this sequencing of events that absolutely applies to potentially predicting future events, especially when you have more than one timeline that triangulates to a specific single date into the future. It increases the probability that you're onto something that's going to happen. But I think that, and I'm a little bit conflicted about this myself, I'm not sure whether the main message we should be taking from this is, oh great, we can now start to really predict the future and we'll make $1 zillion predicting the market, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, maybe, but I can't lose sight of the fact that this is about something more than just attempting to get a handle on something that hasn't occurred yet. It goes to the fundamental understanding of what life is. And I don't want to myself lose the forest for the trees by getting too excited by the notion that one can predict something. Maybe one can. It's something we'll have to see. Lao Tzu, the Taoist sage, had a very interesting saying, which was, "He who can predict does not know, and he who knows does not predict." I'm not altogether sure what he meant by that, but I do find it interesting to apply it to the Synchronicity Code. One can know that there is a sequence of events that are mathematically correlated that point to a particular future date or dates. One can prepare for it. One can see that date come and go. That's one thing. One can know this. But to then assume that one can predict definitively what is going to take place, maybe that's not itself
realistic.
Right. So the subject is an important one, and it's one that needs more digesting by me and others that may become interested in it. Is it possible? It may be. Is there more to the theory than chasing that particular rabbit? I think so.
Well, this work you got here on this book so far, isn't this still a work in progress, if I understand correctly? I mean, you're still learning about it yourself in more depth as you go. Is that right?
Absolutely. This is really just the beginning. And, you know, we all have busy lives, and I'm not sure I'm going to be the one that takes it as much further as others. I will mention very briefly that, this is really an extension of my interest in the sacred geometry of the markets, and that's something that I research all the time. On the website, I have some posts that deal with patterns that form in the market, and one of the most fascinating areas to me is where you see a crossing over of the patterns and events, such as the flash crash that occurred in 2010. That doesn't show up on any chart particularly clearly, but it was a big news story. That then becomes a data point that you can analyze on a technical from a technical perspective on a chart and see future events occur in the market based upon it. So I mention that only because I think that there's an entire world out there that is connected via the notion of sacred geometry and synchronicity, that this is really just the beginning.
I think you're really kind of onto something, because I think it's just really a matter of how much of it do we understand now and how much are we going to understand further down the road. And, you know, I'm really glad you came on the air to talk about this, because I think it's a possibility it can encourage other people to, you know, elaborate on it or see if they find any connections or, you know, what have you. I was going to ask, though, are you going to be continuing to do any more work? Because you talk like you're probably not going to make a lot of progress, but are you going to be trying to make more progress with this as you go on?
Yes, I think so. There are some patterns in particular that I'm watching with interest that, depending on how they unfold, they may lead me forward into new directions. So yes, it's there to be explored, and depending on how things go, it may be that I get much more involved in it. Yes.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure all the listeners are aware that your website is www.synchronicitycode.com. I'll get my tongue untied in a minute. But anyway, if I'm not mistaken, when I was at your website, I noticed you got a comment section there. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
So if people want to, they can go to your site, learn more about you. If they have any questions or any feedback, any suggestions, you're pretty much open to hearing everything everybody has to say. Is that right?
That's correct.
All righty. Is there anything you could think of that maybe I didn't get around to? Because I know that we were a little rushed and we're going to have to reschedule this. And by the way, I do apologize for that.
Oh, no need to apologize. No, I feel comfortable that this was a productive introduction. Thank you for letting me share something of this discovery.
Okay, well, I'm going to be thankful to have you come back. And I want to mention to everybody out there listening, because I put this in the chat room, and not everybody, like I say, listens at this particular website. My show broadcasts at Shoutcast and, you know, other locations, and then people listen to archives at other places. And, you know, they'll hear this before they'll see it. And that is that Tuesday, my guest is going to be Tom Carey, and we'll be talking about Roswell and the research he's done there. It's a pretty popular subject for some folks, so I thought I'd let everybody know if you want to show up Tuesday night at 8 Central Standard Time. I had to stop and think there. We'd be glad to have you here. And again, I'm going to post it around everywhere and let everybody know what date that me and Andrew come up with for his return. Y'all can also find our video, our show, at YouTube, Daily Motion, Media Cafe. It'll be posted over there tomorrow, probably the next day at the latest, unless I get busy. But I'm usually good about keeping up those archives, because if you don't, they'll eat your lunch. Don't forget to stop by United Paranormal International, a great group of researchers over there. May Reed is here. She was one of the membership directors over there, or assistant director. I was glad to have her here. She's also one of my members of the Ancient Mysteries group, if I'm not mistaken. And I've been seeing her post, and I was wondering if I'd ever see her over here, because I saw her join the site, but didn't see her during the live show. So, Andrew, I want to thank you for coming. You've been an interesting and a fantastic guest, and I just don't feel like we had time to really do justice to the whole interview. So I will be in touch, and I will be sending you links to where I archive that at. And I'm going to go ahead and call this a wrap, since I'm almost out of time. And thank you very much for coming.
Thanks so much, Rose.
You have a good day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Long-winded explanation for how I came to it, and maybe that's really the best way to sort of found this. Before I do that, there are really two concepts to hold in mind that help clarify what this is about. One of them is obviously the word synchronicity, which is a term that was invented by C.G. Jung, the great psychologist, which there's certainly a more complicated definition, but for our purposes, it suffices to just refer to that as a meaningful coincidence, one thing that we do find in this particular study is that coincidences are not, or one type of coincidence that becomes prominent is when you have numeric coincidences, ones dealing with exact numbers repeating or multiples of 10, 100, that kind of thing, as a specific numeric synchronicity of a kind. So that's one concept. And the other one, which is much more accessible, I think, is just the notion of cycles, which we see in nature, of course, everywhere. It has been studied quite a bit in the last century or so in terms of economic cycles. And in a way, that's how I came to this particular discovery. I found myself, I'm a lawyer by trade, but early on in my professional career, I became interested in the markets, in fact, very interested, in part because I was wrestling with trying to resolve who I think actually influenced Jung in terms of his theory of synchronicity.
I don't think I heard of him.
Yeah, well, he's not that well known in the West, but he actually probably had something to do with Jung's theory, and isn't typically credited with that. But he had a scientific mind, and he would go out into a park, and he would start counting these clusters of events. A person would be walking in front of him that had an umbrella, and then he'd wait, and there'd be another umbrella. He'd add up and very meticulously study these patterns of people carrying umbrellas on a sunny day or not. And he developed this theory that events actually cluster in a way that really was a synchronicity concept. But he was approaching it without the notion of a meaningful coincidence. It was really just any coincidence. He looked for these patterns. But where I quickly moved away was from thinking that any three events that are of the same nature are going to have a cyclical pattern. I don't think that that's really the place to go. It may be true, but that's not where my focus began to go. Instead, if you take a look at if you're studying cycles in the markets, it's clear you have a high and a low, and a high and a low. You can do a cycle of, you take the time distance between two highs, and you can project forward a third high, mathematically, quite simply, by taking the distance in terms of hours or days or weeks or months and multiplying it forward. But in events occurring in history, there are no peaks, there are no highs and lows the same way there are in the market. So
welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me today is going to be Andrew Goodman. And we're going to talk about his book he recently come out with called the Synchronicity Code. Pardon my tongue tie up there. It's something that he's been developing over the last few years that he thinks he sees something in the underlying background, if I understand this correctly, of the fabric of time and space, that there's a code that things are timed out and happening at certain points in time that you could almost set a clock by, and he calls this the Synchronicity Code. And I can guarantee you, after reading this book, he can explain this far better than I can. It was a fascinating read. I did read it myself, and the math was a little bit beyond me at my present stage, but a little bit of study, I think I can get that down pat. But I'm going to let him tell us a little bit more about it because I don't want to mess everything up. So, Andrew, how you doing?
Very well. Thank you for having me on your program.
Oh, and I want to thank you for coming. I've really been looking forward to this show for quite some time. Did I get that description wrong?
No, that's a fair start at the description, but maybe I can try to summarize it a little bit. I'm going to give you a kind of and you want to digress on it, how exactly that piece came into play, but that was the step that was surprising to me. The way it all came about was I was in the office with a friend a couple of years ago, and was just casually talking about trading in the markets, and at one point I said to him, I bet you those cycles that I study in the markets apply to everything, down to your very sneezes. That was the phrase I used, and he looked at me quizzically, but for me, a light bulb went off in my head. And that night I came home and started Googling around the internet and started looking at historical events, and it was very exciting to see almost from the beginning that if you pick certain prominent historical events, you could see these patterns begin to emerge almost immediately. At first, I thought this was that the typical cliche saying is things happen in three. So
right.
I assumed anytime you had a similar event occur, you would have some sort of a mathematical pattern to it. So I'd be driving to work, and a squirrel would run in front of my car, and then 15 minutes later, another squirrel would run in front of my car, and I'd think, okay, let's look at the mathematical projection of that for the third squirrel. I no longer feel that way. I think that's, by the way, similar. Do you know or have you heard of Kammerer's seriality? He was an Austrian scientist and writer just before the time of Jung. Of my natural interest in things of religion and philosophy with the need to make a living, and I found myself attracted to the trading markets, partly because one day I accidentally came across a advertisement in Futures magazine by a man named Robert Fisher, who was marketing a trading system that was based upon the golden section or the Fibonacci ratio. This struck a chord with me. I'm sure it has with many, but it struck a chord with me in particular because of my interest in philosophy. I majored in philosophy in college. It immediately resounded because of its relationship to the ancient Greek view that all was arranged according to number. So that if Fisher was right that you could detect cyclical patterns in the markets based upon the Fibonacci ratio, then it would be sort of a practical, real-world proof of this theory that was presented thousands of years ago in ancient Greece. So it was that trading background that I think led to this discovery that doesn't certainly can be applied to the markets, but really what the discovery was is that there are mathematically precise cycles in historical events that happen to be glued together by the phenomenon of synchronicity. That is the piece that I think was so novel for me to discover. I can tell you, if we have a moment